Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this special teaching from One Faith, One People Ministries. I'm Andrew Gabriel Roth, and this is the next in the Walking Dedicated Men series. From Joseph to Moses, Part 7 of the Walking Dedicated Men. So up until now, in this series, we've been tracking the astronomical knowledge of a group of ancients spread across a wide geographical area. We've been telling the story of the original biblical calendar in the order of the people who lived in the scripture. But now, with Joseph about to go into Egypt, and with Jacob eventually ending up spending the last 17 years of his life there, things are about to change. These early people were so important that the countries they migrated to often got named after them. Now, Egypt is the first settled civilization to receive these people who grow to a nation of more than 2 million souls. And Egypt often influences her conquerors far more than they do her. This has been true of everyone from the Hyksos to Alexander the Great to the Romans even. These guys, they come to Egypt, and very often they find themselves adopting Egyptian religion, adopting Egyptian customs, rather than try to, be flashy as a foreign power. So how much more would this be true for not the conquerors of Egypt, but for the slaves under their command for centuries at a time? As we go through this part of the series, it's important to draw certain distinctions between astronomical processes and the paganism that is attached to it or operates within it. Clearly, there are certain Egyptian calendar expressions that are inextricably tied to their myths, but it is possible to separate these out and just look at the math and the techniques. For example, here's what the first century Jewish historian Josephus said. For whereas the Egyptians were formerly addicted to different customs, Abram, that's the early name for Abraham, conferred with each of them, whereupon he was admired by them in those conferences as a very wise man and one of great sagacity. He communicated to them arithmetic and delivered to them the science of astronomy. For before Abram came into Egypt, they were unacquainted with those parts of learning. For that science came from the Chaldeans into Egypt, and from there to the Greeks. At this point, however, it's important to give a clarification on what Josephus just said. Even though it seems pretty clear that Josephus is saying the Egyptians got all their astronomical information from Abraham, that is not the extent of the full story, and this is according to Josephus himself. Most Bible scholars agree that Abraham lived from between 2100 to 1800 BCE, by which time the Egyptians had developed extremely sophisticated astronomy, and they had that astronomy in place centuries before. So instead, what I think Josephus may be referring to is the recovery process that Egypt went through after the flood, and that Abraham was the first person to teach them additional astronomical insight after that disaster, after they had to rebuild. I say this because Josephus also tells us that Adam and Seth invented astronomy and actually brought it to Egypt earlier, well before the flood. So let's read. Adam had indeed many other children, but Seth in particular. Now this Seth, when he was brought up, and came to those years in which he could discern what was good, became a virtuous man. And as he was himself of an excellent character, so did he leave children behind him, who imitated his virtues. All these proved to be of good dispositions. They also inhabited the same country without dissensions, and in a happy condition, without any misfortunes falling upon them until they died. And here's the key line. They also were the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order, and that their inventions might not be lost before they were sufficiently known. Upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire, and at another time by violence and quantity of water, they, meaning Adam and Seth, made two pillars, the one of brick and the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them, both in case the pillar of brick should be destroyed by the flood. So the flood hadn't happened yet, obviously. The pillar of stone might remain and exhibit those discoveries to mankind, and also inform them that there was another pillar of brick erected by them. And here's what we're going to be getting into. Now this remains in the land of Syriad to this very day, to this day. Syriad is believed by nearly all historians to be Egypt. Only Egypt followed the star Sirius, which is where you get Syriad. Here's why there's such nearly universal agreement on this. I'm quoting from a particular source that I'll give at the end. This particular expert says, it is possible to identify the missing pillar of the two, the pillar of Sut in the south. Sut is Seth, just so you know. There was a southern Anu and a northern Anu in Egypt. Anu is On, Heliopolis, just one of them is, I should say. And possibly a relic of the two poles might be recognized of the two Anus, viz. Hermonthis, and the Anu of the south, and here's the one we just mentioned, and Heliopolis, the Anu of the north. The original meaning of Anu may have been the place of the pillar or the stone that marked the foundation which preceded the sign or station or dwelling place. There was an Egyptian tradition which connected Sut or Seth as the inventor of astronomy. This is maybe where Josephus is getting this connection, with Anu as the original founder of the pillar, which makes him the primary establisher of the pole. As an astronomical character, Sut was earlier than Shu. That's another figure in their history, in their myth. The Arabs also have a tradition that one of the pyramids was the burial place of Sut. The pillar of brick, being less permanent, went down as predicted in the deluge and was the figure of the southern pole, whereas the pillar of stone remained forever as the image of the north celestial pole, or of Anu, the site of the pillar in the astronomical mythology. It is reported by Diodorus, that's a famous Greek historian around 100 BC, that Anu, Heliopolis in the solar mythos, was accounted by its inhabitants to be the oldest city in Egypt. That's from a gentleman named Gerald Massey. Another Jewish historian, Philo, agrees with the connection between Abraham, astronomy, and Egypt. Philo says, the most ancient person of the Jewish nation was a Chaldean by birth. Obviously, that's Abraham, born of a father who was very skillful in astronomy and famous among those men who passed their lives in the study of mathematics. Philo goes on to talk about Moses' education. Accordingly, Moses speedily learnt arithmetic, geometry, and the whole science of rhythm and harmony and meter, and the whole of music, by means of the use of musical instruments, and the knowledge of the heavenly bodies so much studied by the Chaldeans. There's your connection back to Abraham. And this knowledge he derived also from the Egyptians, who study mathematics above all things. And he learnt with great accuracy the state of the art among both the Chaldeans and the Egyptians, according to the life of Moses. That would be book 1, verses 23 through 24. Both Josephus and Philo were descended from priests and kings on both sides of their family tree. As such, both had access to critical historical documents that modern historians do not. At the very least, they had access to folk tradition, and they have the earliest written witness to that folk tradition. And usually, even inside folk tradition, there is at least some historical fact. So if, as I believe, large parts of what we now call the Egyptian calendar were originally developed by Abraham or even possibly Adam, then maybe it got later corrupted with paganism. But even if I'm wrong about that, I maintain that math is not pagan, and scientific techniques or observational techniques of the sun, moon, and stars, that's not pagan either. And that Moshe himself would have known how to chew the meat and spit out the bones. But either way, I think it stands to reason that this knowledge started with the Hebrews, it went into Egypt, and then was returned to the Hebrews via its prince, Moshe. Then after they get out of Egypt and are on the road in the wilderness and go to Mount Sinai and settle in Canaan, they then reconfigure what they lost. Now let's talk about Philo. We will see then in a bit how the Egyptians counted time by the dark moon. And the reason I'm going to go into this is because there is this common misconception that before computers, nobody could count by dark moon. That because it was dark, nobody could see it, that the ancients couldn't see it, that they didn't know about it, and therefore, Andrew, why are you going on about the dark moon when you know we should be looking for the waxing crescent, blah, blah, blah. And the answer is, it's not true. The ancients were very well aware of conjunction. They reckoned it between the old crescent and the new crescent, and they knew that the conjunction was the start of the month. And if they did that in ancient Egypt in about 3100 BC, I find it hard to believe that Moshe, as we see here, Acts 7:22, knew all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So that's why we're bringing this up. I think it's inconceivable that Moshe, growing up as a prince of Egypt for 40 years, would not have learned their astronomy. And I know what that astronomy was because it's still written in stone, literally, on their tomb walls. And Philo, who lived all of his life in Egypt also, he's an expert. So we're going to look at what Philo has to say. He's raised in Alexandria, Egypt. He had access to the greatest library that the ancient world ever produced, the library in that city, Alexandria, Egypt. He had access to both ancient Hebrew and Egyptian records. The Hebrew records he would have had through his family line, and the Egyptian records he would have had through the Alexandrian library. So I can't think of someone better positioned than Philo to talk about the influence of one calendar on that's in Egypt on the Hebrew people who are in Egypt. So let's see what Philo said about how the Egyptians counted the lunar month. Was it by crescent or was it by dark moon? Well, Philo does say the month begins after conjunction, not the sighted crescent, although for a lot of people out there who believe in the sighted crescent as the hard start, what we call crescent forward only, i.e., that the moment you see that crescent, the month has begun, right? But not before you see it. You would say to me, as I know some of you have, that of course it begins after conjunction. The crescent is after conjunction. But Philo does not mention the crescent as the new moon. So let's get into this. He says here in the special laws, the third festival, which is New Moon Day, comes after the conjunction, which happens on the day of the new moon in each month. It doesn't say the day of the crescent. It says the day of the new moon in each month. So again, Philo says the month begins after conjunction, meaning after the day that conjunction ends the old month. In other words, whenever conjunction happens, it has to end at sunset. And that sunset is the start of the new month. Here's proof of that idea. Philo says, the fourth reason is that all of the bodies in the heaven, of all the bodies in the heaven, the moon traverses the zodiac in the least appointed time. It accomplishes its orbit in a monthly interval. Now here's a really important line. Let's go with me on this. For this reason, the law, or the Torah, has honored the end of its orbit. This is critical. We're talking about the new moon, and the Torah honors the end of its orbit, the point when the moon has finished, at the beginning point from which it began to travel. These are Philo's words, not mine. By having called that day a feast, so that it might again teach us an excellent lesson, that in the affairs of life we should make the ends harmonious with the beginnings. Okay? The month began in darkness with the conjunction. It ends in darkness. For these reasons and others similar to them, the new moon, so this is the new moon has been honored. But go back to this other page. The law has honored the end of its orbit. Therefore, the end of its orbit is the new moon, which is a feast. So this proves at a minimum that the conjunction was known, the conjunction did count as new moon, and the conjunction could be reckoned 2,000 years ago, no problem, by Philo. And that's according to the special laws. Philo's remarks are very important here. For one thing, as we talked about already, we see the end of the orbit is honored in the Torah and called new moon. I'm just repeating that. This matters because the crescent followers, the crescentists as I call them, insist that when the sliver is seen at evening, it is a new moon. In other words, they do not put the moon as new prior to seeing the sliver. And that's true even if it takes 3 nights before they see that sliver. They're still going to say, before I see that sliver, it is not new. Right? But here's the thing. If Philo agrees with them from 2,000 years ago, what he should have said is the beginning of its orbit, which is the crescent, by their own definition, is honored in Torah, not the end of its orbit. And then there's this. Philo just says it plainly. Then the moon ceases at its conjunction with the sun. And there's other resources. Again, the conjunction is the end of the orbit, and it is the new moon. The bottom line is that Philo is both an expert in Egyptian and Hebrew culture. He declares unambiguously, without comparing one to the other, that the new moon was defined by Moses as a dark moon, i.e., at conjunction, when it's dark. Philo then knew that sunset after that moment, conjunction, as the start of the month. The reason that has to be the case is because the sunset after conjunction is the only time between conjunction and crescent. There are many more detailed and specific statements that Philo makes showing that he viewed the dark moon as the new moon. For more information, if you're not already a member of One Faith, One People Ministries, because if you are, you have access to this, please email me at onefaithandrew@gmail.com and ask for the Philo and the New Moon teaching, which gets a lot more technical. Philo was a very, very gifted astronomical person. But next up, we're switching topics not to the testimony of ancient Egypt itself. We need to go into an examination of the workings of the ancient Egyptian calendar. And we're doing a real short, simplified version of it, at least relatively speaking. We have another teaching coming up called The Real Hebrew New Moon, which will go into more details. But in any case, our guy Philo certainly knew the Egyptian calendar very well, and he used it as a basis for his own views on the subject. And we're going to look at to see a direct causal relationship between the ancient Hebrews under Moses and the calendar that the Egyptians had. So let's take a look at this up close. Because over the past several years, I have had to put a great deal of effort in attempting to understand the mechanisms, very complicated, intricate mechanisms of the Egyptian calendar. So I always like to also give credit where credit is due. And much of what I pieced together was based on the work of the famous Egyptologist Richard Parker in his landmark book called The Calendars of Ancient Egypt, done by the University of Chicago in 1950. Now that sounds like a long time ago, and it is. However, I got to tell you, this is still required reading for Egyptologists today. Parker's research holds up very well. All I had to do was basically think it through and use modern techniques to validate it, like computers and things. And that's what my next point is about. I also had to do a fair amount of research and experimentation on my own just to be in a position to validate Parker's conclusions. Calendar research of this kind simply cannot be read in a book. It must be tested out thoroughly and repeatedly. And I believe that the Egyptian calendar is way more precise and intricate than has generally been supposed. The reason it works so well, even now, millennia later, after the age of the pharaohs had ended, was because the Egyptians developed a sophisticated series of separate mechanisms that collectively checked each other rather than by calculation alone. Here's how it was put together, and this is sort of the short, simplified version. Keep telling yourself as I go through a lot of this detail. First, getting into Richard Parker's work, he agrees with Philo. He tells us how the Egyptians counted the lunar month. He says on page 27 of the Calendars of Ancient Egypt, just before dawn on either the 29th or 30th day, the last crescent is still to be seen. On the following morning, it cannot be seen, and the new month begins with this Egyptian word, which I probably won't pronounce right, so I'm not even going to try. But he defines that as the day before new crescent day. The new month begins the day before new crescent day. I have a little explanation on that. I put in the phrase myself, the day before new crescent day, in parentheses. These are my words, because of how Parker himself discusses his own terminology. This Egyptian word is listed as day 1 on a list that Richard Parker provides on page 25 of his book. Day 2 is then listed as new crescent day. Therefore, day 1 is the day before new crescent day. And in other places of his book, Richard Parker calls it the day of invisibility. That's conjunction. Crescent visibility, Parker says, as a base, must be considered ruled out with invisibility of the old crescent as its foundation for Egypt, basically. Invisibility of the old crescent is conjunction. He goes on. The Egyptian lunar month, therefore, did begin on that morning when the old crescent could not be seen. Page 37. So next up, now that we've seen that this great researcher has validated the idea through reading extensive hieroglyphic inscriptions over thousands and thousands of years, and his efforts are just astonishing. Now that we've seen Richard Parker give us this definition of the Egyptian lunar month, we're going to now move on to see how the lunar year for the Egyptians was regulated by the cycles of a particular star. This is kind of fascinating to me personally. This is what he says, Parker. Whatever it may have been in prehistory, meaning the calendar, the first Egyptian calendar of record was lunar. Everybody agrees on this. I have yet to see a single Egyptologist dispute this. And it was based on the heliacal rising of the star Sothis. And this also has widespread agreement, maybe not total agreement, but very close, according to Parker on page 45. But I need to give a little astronomy background here. Sothis and heliacal rising, it's also known as Sirius, or the dog star. And this was the most important star to the ancient Egyptians. Unlike most other stars, Sothis' relative position in the sky did not precess. It did not shift a degree backwards about every 72 years, 71.6 years, or what we now call the precession of the equinoxes. As a result, every 365.25 solar days, exactly 365 days and 6 hours, which is the average year of the Julian calendar, Sothis would return to its starting point about an hour before sunrise. When it does that, we call this heliacal rising, okay? And specifically, Sothis would disappear from the night sky. It would get caught up in the sunlight, right? And it would return 70 days in the eastern sky about, anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes before sunrise. And so it's called heliacal rising. And believe it or not, it's in the Bible. It's, the 70 days that Sirius disappears became the inspiration for ancient Egypt to mummify their pharaohs over 70 days, a fact which is actually mentioned in Genesis. But as for the heliacal rising itself, when the Magi, who were looking for a Messiah, said to King Herod that they saw the king's star rising in the east, the technical meaning of both the Greek and the Aramaic phrases refer to the heliacal rising of Jupiter, the king's star. And like the Magi who saw Jupiter heliacally rise on a particular date in our Gregorian calendar, May 27th, 5 BC. And no, I'm not getting into those details. Those are separate teachings. If you want to find out more about those teachings, contact me at onefaith1peopleministries.com. But my bottom line is that these things can be put to a specific calendar day. May 27th, 5 BC. We know that the Magi left at that time when they saw the king's star rise in the east, and we know the route that they took from Babylon to get to Jerusalem, because Ezra took that route, and it took the Magi about 4 months to get there. That's all, for another time. But again, the point is, Sirius's return can be dated precisely. But let's give you even more detail about this. Basically, during the entire 3,000 plus years of pharaonic history, Sirius's return date to its heliacal rising, the interval of time between one heliacal rising and another, in terms of the Julian calendar, was hitting between July 17th through 19th, making July 18th as the average mean date, and conversion into our current Gregorian calendar much easier. In other words, the cycle of Sirius matched the exact time of a Julian calendar year. But the Julian calendar year is actually about 11 minutes longer than the actual solar year. And the Gregorian estimated year is much closer to that actual solar year, which is why our current Gregorian calendar is much more accurate. So what happens is we can correlate Egyptian cycles to Julian calendar cycles, and by doing so, at the end of the calculation, convert it into our current calendar, because the Julian calendar has lost time as it's gone through the centuries. Anyway, for simplicity's sake, let's fix the date of Sirius's return to July 18th, and just so that we have a fixed calendar date, which we would have going through the actual historical time, and see what Richard Parker says from there. He says, this event, meaning the heliacal rising of Sothis, was called Wap Ronpet, the opener of the year. The 12 months of the normal year were divided into 3 seasons: Akhet, Peret, and Shemu, each having 4 months each. The individual months were named after the most important feasts that occurred in them. So it would be like, for example, us calling, the month of December, we'll call it Hanukkah or Christmas or something like that, instead of calling it December or the 12th month. The first month of the year, the month of the Tehi feast, began with the first day of the invisibility of the moon, so again, conjunction, just before sunrise after Wap Ronpet, after the return of Sirius after 70 days, right? The heliacal rising. We need to take another quick pause, though, to really digest this super important statement that Parker is making. This is the thing. We can read that paragraph in a minute, but it might take an hour to really break down what he means and to test it. First, Parker is saying the Egyptian lunar month began on the first day of invisibility, which is conjunction before sunrise. The conjunction before sunrise. Second, Parker is also stating that the Egyptian lunar New Year's Day, not their civil New Year's Day, that's different, was the first dark moon that happened after the return of Sothis, right? The opener of the year. Now, don't worry about those details. We're simply going to call Wap Ronpet, the return of Sothis or Sirius, we're just going to call it July 18th in our current Gregorian calendar for simplicity's sake. So if there was, say, a new moon on August 5th, that was after July 18th and would be New Year's Day. Well, why don't I just say so, right? But it gets a little bit more intricate than that, because Parker refines this rule, because that's not always going to be the case, what I just described. He says, the 12th month was named Wap Ronpat after the feast, and that feast always had to fall in the 12th month. This is going to point us to intercalation or intercalculation. As the feast, the name of the 12th month and the opener of the year and the return of that star Sirius, they have the exact same name. A modern analogy might be this. Consider that we call our December 31st New Year's Eve and our January 1st the first day of our new year, or New Year's Day. What Parker is saying is that the feast of New Year's Eve must, for the Egyptians, always fall in their 12th month, their December, or their year is thrown off. Similarly, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day for us have the new year in their names, even though they occur in 2 different months. But we're so used to this, we don't think about this. So, again, the same is true for the ancient Egyptians. Or to use another modern analogy, their New Year's Eve, if it's not checked, if they don't provide calculations to intercede, will then slip back to happen in November, then October, then September, and so on. This is because their year is a lunar year, 11 days shy of the solar year. So imagine that your year is now lunar. Because the lunar year was but 354 days long, this is Parker again, whenever the first month began within 11 days, and I'll explain this range, of Wap Ronpet, it was intercalary, meaning they added a leap month, lest at the end of the year the feast of Wap Ronpet would fall out of its month. That's Parker, page 45. Again, please bear in mind, and please bear with me, because I know this is a lot of odd detail that doesn't get discussed in public very often, that this term, Wap Ronpet, is our July 18th. So just think of July 18th when you see this phrase. It is the heliacal rising of Sothis. So let's get into that. What this rule that Parker lays down then, from his expert interpretation of hundreds of Egyptian inscriptions, is, assuming Sothis returns just before dawn on July 18th in any given year, the lunar New Year's Day, they had a civil New Year's Day, but that's another matter, can start as early as 12 days later. So their lunar New Year's Day would start as early as July 30th or as late as 41 days, August 28th. Okay? The reason for that is if it returns earlier than that, they're going to add the leap month. Let me show you. Let's see this concept in action rather than just read about it to really get it all down. Given the return of Sothis or Sirius near sunrise is July 18th. And year one, our hypothetical year one, started as late as possible with the new moon occurring on August 28th of that year. Since your year is lunar, only 354 days long, year two will begin 11 days earlier than year one did on our calendar. So we began on August 28th, we subtract 11 days, and we come to August 17th. Since August 17th is more than 11 days after July 18th, your second year, year two, begins right now. There's no need to add a leap month. Then, with our hypothetical year two beginning on August 17th, 354 days later brings us again 11 days shy of that start, August 6th now. But August 6th is still more than 11 days after July 18th. So, year three begins without delay on August 6th. But then when year three ends 11 days early on July 26th, well, now we've got a problem. That is only 8 days after our July 18th date. So for this, a leap month would have been added in ancient Egypt. If we then add 30 days for that leap month to July 26th, this will bring us to year four, beginning on August 25th, again in our calendar, and the entire cycle starts all over again. The important takeaway for this exercise is simple. Using July 18th, the Egyptians could count in lunar time, but balance to the star Sirius, which in effect kept in harmony with the solar time, to keep the seasons on time. What has baffled many scholars for centuries is that the Egyptians had two cycles that averaged a very familiar number, 365 days. And they spent years looking in vain for how 365 balanced to the solar year of 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 45 seconds. And they were on the wrong trail all along. Because instead, the Egyptians used that star Sirius to figure out when to add the lunar month. So they didn't need to worry about adding a leap day on their solar count because the star Sirius would tell them, okay, you need to add a lunar leap month. But now it's time to look at something very odd. And this is going to sound like I'm saying 2 + 2 = 5. There is in Egypt an average lunar year that equals 365 days. According to Richard Parker on page 67, even as dynastic Egypt in about 3100 BCE was dawning, the government would have noticed that a calendar ruled only by observation was impractical. This is what he says. By this time, Egypt had become a well-organized kingdom, and the economic disadvantages of a lunar year of now 12 months, now 13, all of which began with observation, must have impressed themselves upon the government. Economic disadvantages. In an effort to alleviate the situation and provide a simple and easily workable instrument for the measurement of time, they hit upon the idea of a schematic lunar year, or as it might be termed, an averaged lunar year. Richard Parker, Calendars of Ancient Egypt, page 67. Parker observes this could yield an average of 365 days through two methods. The first method he suggests is simply to count the number of days between two heliacal risings of Sirius or Sothis. That will most definitely yield an average of 365 days without necessarily tracking it in a solar manner. I believe this first method was in fact done by the ancient Egyptians in around 3100 BC, but that over time they would have found it more effective to group lunar years into packs of 25. Parker then lays out the mathematical basis for this second method, a 9,125 day-long cycle that represents exactly 309 lunar months, just 6 days shy of 25 solar years. Let me show you this math. 309 times a very accurate average of the lunar month that will hold over centuries, 29.530588, okay, equals 9,124 days, 22 hours, 50 minutes, and 26.2 seconds. That is less than 70 minutes shy of finishing day 9,125, right? So these 309 lunar months, or 25 lunar years, have to be grouped in a particular numerical sequence. This is the one that Parker suggests. And this is just, there are different categories. Sometimes it's the schematic year is 354 days. Sometimes they add that leap month to a 354-day year and it's 384. Sometimes, again, 354, 354, 384. Again, 355 is because the lunar year is actually 354.37 days. So you get 9 hours into day 355. So you have to account for that. And that's why sometimes you'll have 355 as the number here. And 385 is when they add that 30-day leap month to a 355-day lunar year. And this is just the rest of the cycle. Parker concludes the following. Now, if these figures will be averaged in cumulative fashion, it will soon be apparent that the mean must be 365. In other words, if you add these up and divide it by 25, it is 365 days per averaged lunar year. Thus, by either method, could the Egyptian of the proto-dynastic period, again, that's 3100 BC, could have arrived at 365 days at the proper length for a schematic lunar year, which could be used for administrative purposes. Parker can conclude this with confidence, again, because of this math. What we just saw here, 309 times the lunar month, this is what it equals. And just so that's clear, 365 days times 25, no remainder for 365, just 365 whole days times 25, 9,125 days. So these two figures are within 70 minutes of each other. So this is another 365-day system, the so-called Egyptian civil year, that is not balanced with a leap year every fourth year, because correlating the lunar cycles to the return of that star takes care of that issue. So instead, this schematic lunar year is one part of two 365-day counts. The second one being this 25 periods of 365 days each. And of the 12 months, they have 30 days each in each of these systems. This is now talking about the civil calendar. In the civil calendar, each month has 30 days each, 12 times 30, 360, plus 5 divine birthday feasts, or what they call apagomenal days. I never can pronounce that right, I apologize. Apagomenal days. If Parker is right, and I truly believe he is, because I've confirmed his research with computer techniques not available when he wrote his book in 1950, I've also checked more modern authorities and found that Parker's work holds up very well, then this entire system was available in Egypt more than 1,500 years before Moshe was born, because he said this is from proto-dynastic or dynastic times. So our next and last stop is to look at what Moses, because this is about going from Joseph's sojourn into Egypt to Moshe, what did he know from the wisdom of the Egyptians? This is what I believe a young Prince Moses would have learned in terms of timekeeping and astronomy based on what we have uncovered about the Egyptian calendar. Everything that we've been talking about for the last many minutes here is to tie this back to Moshe, not to venerate ancient Egypt, but to explain where Moshe got his information and how it shows up in the Torah. First thing is Moses would have learned to reckon the Hebrew lunar month as the sunset after the old crescent but before the new crescent, sunset after conjunction. Right? So he would basically take the Egyptian system and forward it to the next sunset, which would, because by the time of sunrise on that day, the crescent has disappeared. So it would be sunset after conjunction. Number 2, Moses' understanding of the dark moon would have given rise to expert observation of that new moon, which he would have passed down to the priests, and it shows up in the Psalms. Blow the shofar at the kiseh, at the dark moon, on our solemn feast day. More of those details are coming in another teaching called the real Hebrew new moon. But let's move on. The third thing that Moses would have known is that the schematic lunar year would have given him a detailed understanding for also predicting moon cycles over a 25-year period. The year lengths will tell him when the next spring new moon must be. In other words, if he knows that it's a 354-day-long average year, he can count from the previous new year to figure out when the that next year's new moon is, or if it needs a leap month. And number 4, the list of estimated year lengths Moses knew from that same list, 354, 384, 385, would have given him insight into how long the individual months within each schematic averaged year would be in advance of observation. Notice I don't say that Moshe doesn't observe the moon. He does, but he gets a calculated backup. He has a calculated estimate that he will compare with observation. So, for example, if Moses knew a year was 354 days long and that Lunar New Year's Day started on a Tuesday, March 25th, he knows the next year is going to start Friday, March 14th, 11 days earlier. Moses would have also learned that the next solar year, the end of the 25th, would always come exactly 7 days after the last day of the 9,125-day lunar cycle. So if we started on Wednesday, March 25th of the next year, because taking the solar year, this is the length of the solar year, times 25, look at this messy number, 9,131. But you've got 1 hour and 18 minutes into day 9,132. 9,132 is 7 days after 9,125. So all this means then that determining the dark moon through observing the old and new crescents as bookends, as well as through reliable mathematical averages, was no problem for Moses. And therefore no problem for Aaron, and therefore no problem for the priests who were told, these are the Moedim, the feasts of Yahweh that you will proclaim. Nor is measuring the moon by conjunction anything new, as some of my critics have said. In fact, the crescent reckoning may prove to be the later method at the end of the day. Ancient Egypt is doing this 3100 BC. Babylon does their crescent reckoning in 2000 BC. Just still looking into that, but it is certainly at least as old as counting the new moon as the waxing crescent. For more information on the Egyptian calendar and the full lunar system they had, as I said, please consult the Real Hebrew New Moon teaching, which will very soon be up there. By the time you're watching this, I'm almost positive it'll be there. It's available free for members of One Faith, One People Ministries. There's my website, onefaithonepeopleministries.com. My members know that very well. Not a member? Consider writing me for a copy, and you can write to me at onefaithandrew@gmail.com. And thank you very, very much for your time in listening to this series on the Walking Dedicated Men. Coming up next in the series is going to be about Moses and the Tabernacle Code, and a lot more coming your way. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening. I'm Andrew Gabriel Roth, and as we all like to say in Hebrew, Shalom.